contracting because the cost is upfront as opposed to pay-as-you-go fossil fuels. So I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but I hope that maybe with a rephrasing to some other experts, we can drill down on that a little bit deeper.
Great. Any other questions from the committee? Representative Grochowski, as I read the bill, if there are revenues, if there are excess revenues, those are put into retiring debt early. And so essentially building the equity that belongs to ratepayers more quickly. Is that accurate?
Yes. Yeah. So if there was an if the assumption was that it was going to cost a bit more than it did, and the surcharge was a bit higher than it needed to be to cover the costs for the operation of that year, then that money would go back into retiring debt. There is no one to receive profit but the ratepayers, who are the ultimate financiers of these projects via the authority.
Great. Any other questions for the sponsor? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Representative Grochowski. And I just received word that we are now streaming live on YouTube. So thanks to the magical tech fairies who have repaired things for us. We will now go on to testimony in support of the bill. And again, as I mentioned previously, we limit you to 3 minutes for your oral testimony, but please do submit testimony in writing. We will be reading it. Refer us to that, hit the high points, and we may have questions for you as well. So we will begin with Dr. Richard Silkman, and up next will be Clifford Krolik. Mr. Silkman, Dr. Silkman.
Thank you very much, Representative Berry and Senator Lawrence, members of the committee. My name is Rich Silkman. I live in Scarborough and am the CEO of Competitive Energy Services. I'm here today to support LD 1634. As most of you know, I've been before the committee on a number of occasions and have indicated to you that one of the central aspects of transitioning from our current energy system to one that has zero carbon in the future involves the substitution of paying for fuel costs, natural gas, heating oil, gasoline, to paying for electricity. And when we look at that electricity that's generated, what's the characteristic of that electricity is it's very heavy capital intensive. To give you just a quick example, over the life of the Calpine plant in Westbrook, for instance, the costs of operating that plant are probably 80% fuel, 20% non-fuel related. Looking differently at the cost of a solar facility, the costs are probably close to 90% capital, 10% some property taxes, O&M, those kinds of costs. For wind projects, it's 80% capital. So the cost structure changes, and when the cost structure changes, we need to pay attention to that when we look at financing projects. And the best way to finance projects when you have high capital is cheap debt, cheap equity. That's available through the Revenue Bonding Authority, that's available through the state, and in particular, in our case, the Maine Generation Authority. The testimony that I presented, I won't go through it in any great detail. I would like to spend just 2 seconds responding to Representative Kessler's question. I think of the Green Bank, Representative Kessler, as things financed behind the meter. I think of the Maine Generation Authority as things financed in front of the meter. That's generation related or storage related. And to Representative Foster's question, all of the property that's invested, all of the investments by the authority will be owned by the authority. Now, the authority is a quasi-state agency, and so it's owning it on behalf of the state, as Representative Grochowski mentioned, but it is owned and ultimately paid for by ratepayers. So to the extent that you're a citizen, you participate, but you participate through your operations or activity as a ratepayer. That's the key distinction here. The bonds that are issued by the Maine Generation Authority are revenue bonds. They are not general obligation bonds of the state. The state is not pledging its full faith and credit as it might do for the bonds that you folks put out to referendum, for instance, every year at the end of your sessions. These are obligations of the authority only and paid for by ratepayers only. The last thing I would like to emphasize is something Representative Grochowski said, is that no matter how we build out this grid, the ratepayers are going to pay for it. I mean, there is no free money out there. And the question is whether that's paid for by utilities, that is, the utilities own them and pay for it, like, for instance, we're doing in Massachusetts with the offshore wind projects, whether on the other hand, these are projects that are paid for, like our 1494 or 1711 projects. I mean, these are all projects that ultimately are paid for by ratepayers. And it's in Maine's best interest to make sure that ratepayers pay the least amount possible for these projects. The Maine Generation Authority does that, but it does not build the projects. It does not operate or maintain the projects. Those are done by private companies through competitive bidding processes, just like the Maine Housing Authority or the Maine Turnpike Authority undertakes its affairs. So with that, Representative, I'll stop and be happy to answer any questions people might have.
Thank you, Dr. Silkman. And we have a question from Representative Cuddy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Silkman, for being here and for your testimony. I want to connect something that Representative Grochowski said and something that you just said and make sure that I actually understand what you said. So the idea is that no matter what, if we are building new generation, ratepayers are going to be the ones who are paying for it. And essentially, we have our current model, which is that developers, independently owned private institutions are borrowing money to build solar, wind, whatever they're building. And then we are paying, the ratepayers are paying for that 6, 7, 8, 9% loan. And what Representative Grochowski is proposing here is that through the borrowing power of this authority, we would be able to do that at a lower interest rate. I'm stating that to you because I think that's what I understood you all have said, and I want to make sure that I've got that correct. Do I have that correct, sir?
Yes, you do. That's exactly correct. Okay. If you think about a project, let's say one of the 1494 projects, a 100 megawatt solar project built somewhere in Maine, that has a construction cost associated with it. Let's say it's just to keep it simple, let's say it's $1 a watt. Well, that becomes a $100 million project. If that's built by the authority, that is, if it's contracted, the authority contracts with the developer to build the project, then what happens is that contractor builds the project, pays $100 million for the project, and those are his costs. It's financed then over 30 years at whatever the authority can borrow the money at, 2.5%, 3%, whatever the market supports. If, on the other hand, the developer owns the project, then it has to secure financing for that $100 million. And it goes to its equity, it goes to its banks. At the banks, we're looking at 5%, 4.5% maybe for a portion of the financing. For the equity, you can ask folks who may be testifying later on today what they want for equity, the developers of projects, but my experience is that they want 10 to 15%. And when you combine those two, the numbers look like double or even triple what the authority borrows at. The other great advantage, of course, is that when we sign contracts with these projects, they're 20-year contracts. But we pay for the project over the first 20 years. And at the end of the 20 years, the ratepayers have nothing. In the authority model, the authority owns the project, and at the end of the 20 years, there's no 20-year here, but at the end of the 20 years, the authority gets the output from the 21st year, the 22nd year, the 23rd year going forward. And so you don't have this problem associated with these cliffs with contracts. At the end of 20 years, the state's paid for this project, but it has nothing to show for it at the end of the 20 years. So there's a lot of value at the back end of this that I think has to be considered as well.
Any follow-up? Representative?
No, thank you.
Okay, we'll turn next to a question from Representative Wadsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for being here, Dr. Silkman. I majored in economics, and so this feels a little too centrally planned for me, where it's not really a core function of government. You know, I get Maine Turnpike Authority because I see roads as being a core function of government, but I don't know if I see generation as being a core function of government. Do you also support the public ownership of T&D infrastructure as well?
And I do. I think that the case for T&D ownership falls on the same, along the same economic structure as the case for the Maine Generation Authority. But I think that they are very different. When you look at the T&D and delivery system, I mean, there is a reliability element, there's an operations element, there's a planning and functioning element that's very essential, and you have to worry about that. You have to pay close attention to it. On the generation side, I think these are projects that are well understood. They are projects that don't have a lot of risk going forward on the operations side, or even on the construction side. And I think so there is a little bit of a difference there between the two. But I do support the notion of a public power authority. As to whether or not it's a core function of government, I think that's up, that's something that is up for debate. And a lot of parts of the country answer it differently. In the state of Nebraska, the generation of electricity is a core function of government. They have public authorities, they have public utility districts. We have decided, just as an example, that in some parts of Maine, Madison Electric and so on, those are core functions of government. The neighboring town, it's not. So I think the notion of a core function is flexible and depends upon, in some respects, where you believe value can be provided to citizens.
Any
Thank you
follow-up?
very much. Nope, thank you.
Great. Representative Kessler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Dr. Silkman. I am not an economics major, and so I would benefit from understanding how is this going to be initially funded? How will ratepayers pay for this initially, and how is that any different from how we're already doing long-term contracts?
The initial funding, as Representative Grochowski mentioned in the bill, is from a loan from the Efficiency Maine Trust. There's nothing special about that, but you need startup money. And the authority has no ability to start up, get its operations going, and without cash, without money. So what we could do is we could borrow the money initially from the market, but it's just hard to do that without the authority being in place. There's no board, there's no directors, none of that stuff is in place. So the way the bill is structured is that there's an initial loan from the Efficiency Maine Trust for $1 million, at which the authority will pay 3%, and it will be paid off over 3 years, enough to get it started. Think of it as seed capital. Once it's up and running, it will support projects that are being developed through its bonding authority. And that bonding authority will allow for the recovery and the financing of its operating costs. Those operating costs will be very minimal because we've limited it to, the bill limits it to what it can engage in. I mean, it cannot engage in energy arbitrage. It can't engage in operating and maintaining facilities. It can't hire builders to build facilities. It can't do all of the things that the private sector does very well. I mean, all it really is a financing vehicle. But because it's going to end up owning these projects, it will pay attention to how those projects are built, just like the Turnpike Authority does. It will have an engineer or two on staff that will monitor construction, make sure it's done correctly, make sure contracts are adhered to. Again, just like the Turnpike Authority does.
Any follow-up?
No, thank you very much.
Okay, back to you, Representative Cuddy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Dr. Silkman, given that, as you just said, that the ownership of these projects would fall to the Maine Generation Authority, how would the Maine Generation Authority and the PUC interact with each other?
The Maine Generation Authority needs a revenue stream to support the debt and to support its operations. Part of that revenue stream will come from the selling of energy generated from the projects. But it's unlikely, I was going to say it's not going to, it's unlikely to cover its full cost because the projects are more expensive than what they're going to get in the marketplace. We need to bridge that gap. So because it's not going to cover its full cost, it's going to have to recover the balance of that from ratepayers. And the way to do that is to include a surcharge on the rates of everybody in Maine to make up that differential. The rates are established by the Public Utilities Commission in Maine. The rates for transmission and distribution utilities are established by the PUC. So what the PUC is charged with doing is it's charged with establishing that surcharge on the bills based upon the costs that the Maine Generation Authority provides to it, and what the Public Utilities Commission understands to be the usage of all customers, ratepayers in Maine, and it determines what that surcharge is. The utilities collect the surcharge every month, just like they do now for the Efficiency Maine Trust. And at the end of the month, what they do is they remit it back to the authority, and the authority has that money to pay off the debt service and the interest and principal and its operating costs under the legislation. So the PUC its role is to establish that charge.
Okay. Quick follow-up.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if there's going to be a new charge set by the PUC to support the Maine Generation Authority, do you see that new charge as being less expensive than what would be saved by ratepayers over time, given the lower rates for capital?
Oh, most certainly. I mean, right now the PUC is charging ratepayers under various headings in the rates, but most of it is stranded cost. They're already charging for all of these contracts that we're entering into, whether they're the communities, the community wind, community solar, or whether they're now the 1711 or ultimately the 1494 contracts when these projects come online. They're going to recover that differential from ratepayers. Here, though, the differential will be smaller and considerably smaller because the costs associated with financing these projects is significantly less.
And Representative Foster is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Siltman, for being here today with the bill that you've authored. I'm wondering how you square the projects that the PUC has approved, large projects that they've approved that are coming in at 3.5, approximately a little less, a little more, 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour, with what you're saying shows a need for this authority that you're suggesting in the bill.
Let's take a look at a 3.5 cent solar project. And that project is 3.5 cents is what the developer indicates it needs to build the project, finance it, and operate it. If you ask the developer, what was the cost to build the project? The cost per watt, what did the final cost come in under? And then you take whatever that number is. If you take that number, Representative, and you say, okay, I'm going to finance that at 3%, and then look to see what you need as a revenue per kilowatt hour generated, which you will find out is it's less than 3.5 cents. I guarantee it. So we signed a contract with these developers for 3.5 cents. That's a good price. Looking around, that's not a bad price. But if we had had the authority in place, the authority had done that bidding process, and the authority had bid out the construction of those projects and then financed it, ratepayers would be paying over the next 20 years less than the 3.5-cent charge. And then at the end of the 20 years, we would still have the output of the project. We would still get benefits. Right now, under all of those 1494 projects, at the end of 20 years, what happens is that project has no obligation to deliver to Maine ratepayers. Whatever value there is still left, the developer owns and retains. So that's why the authority, I mean, that's how you square that authority benefit that it provides to ratepayers. Is it 3.5 cents is not a bad price, but it's certainly not the lowest price possible given various financing arrangements that we could structure.
Any follow-up there, Representative Foster?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And just as a follow-up, I've only been at this for a short time, started in the 129th, happened to land on EUT. Came out of the private sector industry after almost 40 years. And I saw how capital was invested and how it had to be beneficial to the companies that I worked for and profitable and so on. What I've seen in my time here is that due to politics, the costs that the ratepayers are now facing and that the PUC has pushed back against are much higher than they might have been because of changes made to and bills submitted and changes made to those bills that benefited certain groups over the ratepayers. I'm wondering how you think that a quasi-governmental entity that is going to have a board appointed politically can possibly stay away from those same issues where that this would become a political animal that would favor some and probably at the expense of ratepayers. Thank you.
It's a fair question, Representative. I mean, and it's a good question. It's one that you should ask. I mean, there's no guarantee that down the road, the board won't become co-opted by special interest groups and do things for the benefit of those interest groups. Just like there is no guarantee that your commission, your committee, won't be co-opted by special interest groups and do things that are not in the best interest of ratepayers. I mean, I can't give you a guarantee that the board will operate completely independently for the next 30 years. I mean, it's a board that will be appointed. If you think that there is a better way of structuring the board that insulates it better, perhaps through elections, perhaps through a combination of appointments and elections, perhaps through different confirmation processes, then by all means, make the modifications to the bill. This is modeled on the Turnpike Authority. I'm sure that we can go back and look at the Turnpike Authority's 50-year, 60-year history and find a few examples of projects that were undertaken perhaps for political reasons. But I also think that if we look at the Turnpike Authority and ask how it has functioned with its board structure, I think the general sense is that it's done a pretty good job. And that's over a long period of time. You know, politics has largely remained out of it. As I say, I'm sure we can find some examples, but I don't think as long as we're going to build, thousands of megawatts of generation in Maine, and we have to do that if we're going to achieve our climate goals. There's no question in my mind that politics is going to try to get into that decision one way or another. Politics finds money. I mean, that's what it's attracted to. And ultimately, it's going to be a problem that you folks have to deal with. When I say you folks, it'll be your successors and next legislators and so on. But there is no way to insulate those kinds of decisions, whether they're made by the PUC, whether they're made by your committee, whether they're made by a board. There's no way to insulate it from politics. You have to decide which way you think is the least bad of all the options that we have.
If I may, Mr. Chair, one last question.
Sure.
And I appreciate that you and I agree on something, and that is that politicians, whether they're on this committee or others, certainly bring their prides and prejudices to this forum. But I am wondering, you've looked at this for quite a long time now. You've seen what's happened with bills that were passed over the years, especially in the 129th. I would like your opinion on how the PUC has done, even though we have charged them with changing things on how we want them to do things. I was wondering if you could speak to how you think they've done with protecting the ratepayers in spite of some of the legislation we've passed. In other words, do you think they've done a good job? And that would be, I'd like your opinion on how they're doing. Thank you.
It's always difficult to comment on the performance of an agency that occasionally you appear before. It's tough to be, perfectly straight, but I'm to the point now where I'm old enough that I can do that. I think the PUC has done a mixed job. I think they've done a pretty good job on administering 1494. There are constraints that you imposed on them. They operated under those constraints, and they did, as I say, a pretty good job on dealing with it. I don't think that the PUC has done a very good job with respect to regulating the performance of our T&D utilities. I don't think they have done a good job, for instance, overseeing the implementation of the billing system that was developed over the last 5 years. I don't think that they have done a good job in looking at some of the longer term things that we are facing here, and in particular on issues like, for instance, the design of electric rates. And they know that. I don't think that. I've been in front of them on a number of occasions telling or suggesting that we should do it differently than we currently do it, how we structure our electric rates. But those are things that we have to focus on going forward. So I think it's mixed. I think that where you've given them direction and you've told them to do things, I think that they've been generally a pretty good steward of your direction. I think they've done what you've told them to do, and they've done it generally pretty well. But I think that there are a lot of other things that they have to start focusing on now as we start this transition. And there's been a little bit of a weakness in that going over the last few years.
Thank you. Representative Foster.
I apologize for going beyond my one last question. Just to clarify, Dr. Silkman, I was referring to, for instance, their move to not award bids for the net energy billing contracts that they received back at the beginning of the year, which in effect, part of your bill, I think, looks to address rate costs. That would have been a key driver for increased rate costs had they let that go. So I was wondering, were you on board with that decision, or did you think they should have allowed those bids to go through?
If they had allowed those bids to go through, I would have fired them all the next day. Those were terrible bids. Those prices were way above what anybody could reasonably should expect to pay for solar projects. They did exactly the right thing. And in fact, I have recommended to them in filings to them that they come back to you and say, get rid of that program, eliminate it completely. That distributed generation procurement, it's not the right way to go. The generation authority is a far better approach.
Great. Any further questions? I know we have some folks who in the queue who need to have a hard stop soon, so I'm hoping that we can move on. Dr. Silkman, will you be available for the work session on this bill?
Yes, I will. Yeah.
That's great. Okay. Thank you. Any further questions from the committee about this legislation? And I think I'm seeing a hand still. Is Representative Carlo, I see your hand. I see two Representative Carlos. All right. We will come back to questions from Representative Carlo. Committee members are encouraged to follow up with folks between now and the work session, as always. And I'm going to bump up Sam May in the testimony because I know he has a hard stop in approximately 60 seconds. Sam, the floor is yours.
Great. Hi. Good morning. Senator Lawrence, Representative Berry, members of the committee. My name is Samuel May, and I live in Portland. I'm submitting testimony in support of LD 1634, an act to create the Maine Generation Authority. As Dr. Silkman has pointed out in his testimony, a significant decarbonization of Maine's economy will require the substitution of non-fossil fuels as the source of power generation. In order to meet our climate goals, we will need to generate power via solar, wind, hydro, biomass, etc., on a large scale. Instead of paying as you go for imported gasoline, heating oil, natural gas, we will need capital investment in new generating facilities. This will cost significant amounts of monies. But the good news is there's a vast market to provide debt financing. At a high level, there are three sources of funding available for investment: equity, debt, and retained profits. Government does not issue equity as a means of funding. Rather, it uses taxation. And generally speaking, government does not operate with the intention of generating profits to plow back into its operations, which brings us to debt. According to data from the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board and the Securities Industry Financial Market Association, the corporate securities market, i.e. non-governmental debt, totals $10 trillion, while the municipal securities market totals $4 trillion. The municipal category comprises revenue bonds and general obligation bonds, with revenue bonds accounting for 60% and general obligation bonds 40%. That's $2.4 trillion of revenue bonds out in the market already. The market for revenue bonds is deep and broad. More than 1 million issuers, 35,000 trades per day, $12 billion average daily trading amount. 2/3 of these securities are held by individual investors. Default rates for these bonds is 0.18%, vastly lower than the corporate bonds at 1.74. The annual amount of new revenue bonds issued is around $400 billion each and every year. There is a vast marketplace out there waiting to fulfill our needs. Here's a quote from the MSRB on what a revenue bond is and is not. Quote, "Revenue bond is the term used to describe a bond that is payable from a specific source of revenue. The issuer of a revenue bond is not obligated to pay principal and interest on its bonds using any source other than the sources specifically pledged to the bond. Revenue bonds are payable from identified sources of revenue and do not permit the bondholders to compel taxation or legislative appropriation of funds not pledged for payment of debt service. The Maine Generation Authority will be fully insulated from the state of Maine with no bleed over to general obligation bonds and bond ratings." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. May. Mr. May, did you say whether you're representing any particular organization or you're here in a personal capacity?
No, I'm here in personal capacity
Okay.
as a former Wall Street analyst and financial analyst.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Okay, we appreciate your joining us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here.
And up next, we have Clifford Krolik. There you are. Couldn't find you on the bingo screen.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good morning, Senator Lawrence and Representative Berry, and distinguished committee members of Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee. My name's Clifford Krolik. I'm a co-coordinator with the Shakopee Community Forum, another forum. I've lived in the town of Parsonsfield for 50 years, and I am now 71. Electricity is a necessity, an inescapable resource of modern society. It's something akin to drinking water and air. It is a natural resource that the general population will always require. My belief is that the control of all locally generated electricity should remain in the hands of local people, not left to a process of privatization. With an ever-growing abundance of locally produced power, I would trust, support a Maine Power Generation Authority run by a cross-section of Maine people. The last thing we want to do is give up our rights of control of this locally produced power. I want to step out in front and really applaud Representative Gorosky and Dr. Silkman for filling us in on the specifics and details of what a project like this would entail. And I also want to note that this is probably, for the first time in history of electrification on our planet, both regionally and for that matter, statewide, we're witnessing vast quantities of locally produced electricity. Throughout the globe for the past decade or so, electricity is no longer generated by a faraway production plant and then transported for often hundreds or thousands of miles to where it will be used. The great losses over long distance transmission of electricity is a measure of how sustainable a society is. I believe that by generating most of our electrical needs locally, this will offer us the greatest chance to truly be resilient. The present and future is in energy generation. A locally owned and operated power generation authority will provide greater economic opportunities, equitable pricing, and a reliable service for Maine as we rapidly transition into a clean, locally generated energy future. I just want to thank everybody on this committee for the dedication to service and to help move Maine, sometimes kicking and screaming, into a resilient, sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Krolik. And that was just about 3 minutes on the dot. Nicely done. Any questions from the committee? All right, we appreciate your testimony. Thanks for joining us. We will go next to testimony from David Bilski. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Please correct me if not. And if you could turn on your video, that would be great as well.
Senator Lawrence, Representative Berry, and members of the committee, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to submit testimony in favor of LD 1634. My name is David Bilski, and I am a resident of New Harbor in Lincoln County. I submit this testimony on behalf of the Maine Unitarian Universalist State Advocacy Network, or MUSON. I'm proud to add the voice of Maine's 25 Unitarian Universalist congregations in support of this legislation, which would speed the transformation of our fossil fuel-based energy sector by financing the creation and development of clean electricity, both generation and storage throughout the state. Our support for this bill derives from two of our faith's principles, one of which is the respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. The practical manifestations of this respect are, of course, many and varied. The thrust of what this particular bill is meant to deal with are the threats that climate change pose to our state citizens and environment. Statements ranging from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, to Maine's Climate Action Plan, all point to the need to act quickly and boldly to address the various dangers of climate change, which are already showing up in Maine, including, among other things, drought, storm intensity, sea level rise, and ocean warming and acidification. Respect for the environment, whether it's the atmosphere, the land, the oceans,